So in my last few videos, I've tried to give an account of what happens during this DMT breakthrough that I've been describing so far. So remember, the breakthrough, again, as we defined, is the experience which occurs beyond a threshold amount of DMT. And so, again, how we define it is the fact that when people smoke a high amount of DMT, they usually come across this mandala-shaped door, this chrysanthemum-shaped object. And the breakthrough itself, perhaps what it's named for, is when you go past this membrane, when you break through the membrane. And that's when you find yourself in this, this crazy hyperdimensional world with machine elves and entities that come up and greet you, that, the ones that we've been talking about, and they tell you like the secrets of the universe and whatnot. That's the breakthrough experience that we've been discussing. I've shared a few examples of this experience, but what I want to make clear is that just because I've only talked about 4 or 5 different individuals, this is a very common experience when people smoke high amounts of DMT. There are a huge number. So in like the original book that I wrote, there's a huge number of DMT cases which are taken directly from this book, which is an account of Dr. Rick Strassman's experimental trials with DMT, where he gave people high amounts of DMT intravenously and then later on recorded what happened to them subjectively, what they reported. And these reports are very much in line with everything that we've been discussing. They talk about these autonomous entities, the communication with these entities, the fact that this world seems more real than real, the fact of time dilation, all of these features of the DMT experience are very universal. There have also been broader surveys conducted recently, after I finished the book, involving around 2,000 participants, which is a very high number. And again, the picture I painted with the few examples that I used to illustrate the DMT breakthrough experience pretty much do cover what occurs with most people who do break through. And so I won't be discussing any more individual cases because I would just be repeating myself over and over again. Instead, what I want to discuss is what this experience actually means and how we can explain it. So the first explanation, and the one favored by any rationalist, is that DMT, like any other psychedelic, causes an intense mental hallucination. And you're probably thinking this is the most likely explanation. And so we have to think for a moment, how is it possible that the brain can generate an experience of this magnitude just using its sort of internal faculties? And there are a few ways to account for this. The main point that I want to stick to in terms of trying to rationally explain this experience is the fact that psychedelics increase suggestibility to such a high degree. So somebody under the influence of psychedelics, they're extremely susceptible to suggestibility, and they're extremely gullible. So you can convince them of rather crazy things, just because their state of mind is very flexible and they're very open to sort of new ideas, rather than having their sort of skeptical filters on. And so what's possibly happening is that this part of your brain that kind of controls skeptical thinking is shut off to such a degree that you just convince yourself that this whole crazy DMT experience happened, that you saw these entities, that you went to another dimension, and that you received all these crazy insights. Really, none of this is actually happening. It's just that the part of your brain that can rationally distinguish what's actually going on from what you perceive has been shut off, and so you come up with this crazy story involving entities and all that. And then the next question which would follow from that is, then why are the DMT experiences so similar? Even this is an interesting question, because even like sub-threshold psychedelic trips, sub-threshold, again, below the breakthrough limit that we've been discussing so far, they tend to be pretty random and chaotic, and people report a lot of different experiences. Obviously there are similarities, because obviously there are similarities in the human mind, and so there are naturally going to be similarities whenever people explore their unconscious minds. That's a given. But the DMT experience between different people is very, very similar to a very strange degree, and so we have to account for that. And obviously the simplest answer is just what I've been saying before, the fact that all humans share basically the same subconscious architecture of their minds. Obviously not exactly the same, because there are genetic differences between different individuals, but deep in the roots of what it means to be a human, we're all basically the same, the same creature. Individual humans don't differ that much from each other, and so obviously we're going to have these shared experiences when we shake up our minds to such a degree. So despite this being the rational explanation, the explanation I would give you if I were purely a rationalist, there is something utterly strange about DMT which in my mind completely resists this notion. It's very easy for somebody who hasn't had this experience to just say it was merely a hallucination. And that explanation is inadequate because, frankly, we don't know what that means. What does it mean for something to be just a hallucination? Nobody knows what a hallucination is. And so to say something is just a hallucination is not an explanation. It's an attempt to sort of shuffle the problem away so we don't have to deal with it. We don't know what consciousness is, and we don't know what hallucinations are. So just to say something is just a hallucination really is not addressing the issue of what's going on. I think this explanation is okay, just saying it's a hallucination as kind of a placeholder until we know what consciousness is. But again, DMT is on a different level. There's something else going on here. Something which makes it seem very unlikely that the brain is actually capable of generating this. It seems highly unlikely that the brain can ever acquire this level of detail just purely internally, especially if the detail seems to be of a greater complexity than that of the world, of the ordinary world as you perceive it. And one point which illustrates this is the fact that the DMT world and where you go, it's not very chaotic. In fact, the world itself seems extremely structured, extremely ordered. It seems like when you're there, it makes perfect sense that this place you've been to, this place that you're visiting, is a real place. That's what it feels like. So with that said, with kind of like the logical explanation out of the way, I want to propose something which is completely crazy, an attempt to validate it in this video. And the claim that I'm going to make, and it's going to, again, sound crazy, but bear with me because I have, I don't, I'm not just saying this, I'm not just saying this without considering. I really tried to think about these things. And the conclusion, or not, I guess not conclusion technically, but the idea that was forced upon me and that I was forced to genuinely consider is the fact that this DMT dimension is real. That DMT, for some reasons which will remain obscure until I discuss it later, can take you to a different dimension, a different universe. You actually go there. You actually leave your body and go to this universe. Again, if this is startling and crazy and, you're already kind of thinking this is bullshit, whatever, I do have genuine reasons for thinking this. It's not just me merely having like a schizophrenic raving or whatever. And of course, one of the reasons I actually make this claim, even though it's completely crazy, is to stoke the necessary curiosity. I keep making this point over and over again. This is one of the craziest experiences a human being can have, and yet no scientist, or, not many scientists are looking into this as deeply as it should. And so if I figured if I propose something crazy like this, then scientists will be eager to prove me wrong. And of course, scientists should be attempting to prove me wrong. You shouldn't be attempting to prove me right, because the thing that I'm proposing is so crazy that we should all be attempting to prove that it's wrong. Because if it turns out that it's right, the implications are extremely shattering. And of course, only by sort of rigorously approaching this matter can it be proved wrong. We shouldn't just shuffle it away. We should be studying it. And so even if my hypothesis is wrong, the studying this drug will reveal something utterly profound about the human mind. That is for sure. So as to how this is actually possible, how it is that a drug can take you to a different world, as I'm claiming, will have to be kind of left for different videos. There is actually, believe it or not, a logical, perhaps not immediately apparent, but there is a fairly coherent way to explain why this is actually possible. The only reason it's startling is because, we just didn't expect it, but it is internally consistent. And we don't even need to, a lot of people are probably imagining that something supernatural is happening. And that's an interesting point, but I don't think we need to invoke the supernatural in order to account for this experience, believe it or not. Like an out-of-body experience, you immediately assume something supernatural is going on, but I actually don't think you need to, invoke supernatural forces or the supernatural in general in order to account for that. So hopefully that reassures some of you. It might disappoint some of you, but there are, this is a very complicated matter, and the more we look into it, the more things aren't what they seem. That's all I'll say about that for now. So what are my reasons for thinking that this experience is real? In other words, that people do actually visit a different place on DMT. So the first and most obvious reason is the fact that people who have the breakthrough insist without a doubt that the experience was more real than real, and that it's impossible for their minds to have generated this experience. It's just seemingly impossible. In other words, the DMT world is orders of magnitude more complicated than the reality in which we currently inhabit. And that's crazy to think about. So, and the metaphor that I used in the last video was that it's not like DMT is somebody, falling asleep and having a dream. It's like waking up out of a dream. It's as if this world around you, which you're currently experiencing, is some kind of an illusion, and the real world is the DMT world. That's what it seems like. So logically speaking, it is impossible for the brain to generate something which is this much more detailed and this much more complicated than ordinary reality. The truth is psychedelics actually can do this to a degree. Remember, we discussed the brain as a kind of reducing valve, which constrains experience. So there is a world around you which you're not exactly perceiving because your brain kind of just filters it all out. And psychedelics kind of they lift these constraints a little bit, and so you can perceive things which you don't ordinarily perceive. And that sounds similar to DMT because you experience this world which is more complicated than reality. But the DMT world is orders of magnitude much more complicated than anything that psychedelics can generate below the threshold. It's an entirely different, huge, complicated, sophisticated, and somehow internally self-consistent world. It's not just a simply more detailed world than the world we currently inhabit. It's much more complicated, much larger seemingly, and, you know, again, more real than reality itself. And the thing is, 91% of the people reported in that Journal of Pharmacology study that I discussed earlier with the 2,000 participants, 91% of them said that they believed that the experience wasn't generated by their minds. They felt like, and they genuinely believed that they left their bodies and went somewhere else, and that really encountered these entities. And of course, these people shouldn't just be dismissed out of hand because, you know, oh, well, they're druggies or something, you know, we can't believe them. I don't think they should be immediately dismissed. I think we should be taking this claim very seriously, especially 91% of people make the claim. Now, the word I use is superconscious. What I mean by superconscious is the fact that your brain isn't involved. It goes beyond sort of, you know, what your brain is construing. So it's not something generated by your brain, is something beyond that. And so what's seemingly happening on DMT is that when you smoke this drug, somehow your consciousness, whatever that is, you know, we're not even, it's not even totally clear what's going on, but this is kind of the best way I can construe it, is that your consciousness somehow leaves your body. And by doing so, leaves your mind. And your mind, again, is this kind of constrained object, but it no longer has these constraints, which is why it's able to perceive this DMT world and sort of all of its complexity and sort of take in things which the brain ordinarily is unable to perceive. And again, the reasons for this are, I kind of have to leave to be kind of vague now. I promise I will attempt to explain why this is possible, but for now, I'm just kind of discussing my reasoning here. Okay, now obviously, just because a lot of people believe something doesn't necessarily make it true. Like, a lot of people at one point believed that the Earth was flat, and apparently still do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is true. So we need to kind of look at other reasons for why this DMT dimension is actually, as I suggest, a real place. So the line of reasoning that I utilize in the book, it's a little bit complicated, so I'll try to take you through it. But I think it is coherent and sound. Involves the idea of qualia. So again, I'm very interested in the psyche and in the mind, and understanding things like qualia. I highly recommend checking out some of your videos. Hopefully I remember to put them in the description, which go into much greater detail than I'm going to here about the reality of the psyche, one of the big Jungian themes. If you want to be a Jungian, you should probably understand the reality of the psyche, as well as kind of what qualia are, I guess in another video. And yeah, hopefully that'll sort of clear up some of the things which I'm leaving a bit vague here. But qualia are essentially anything that you subjectively experience, and they can't exactly be described through language unless you kind of compare them to a different qualia or replicate them. A good example would be like the color green. So color green is a subjective experience. It corresponds to a physical phenomenon, you know, wavelengths of green light, but the actual experience of the color green is very unique, and it's very hard to describe what green actually looks like unless I compare it to a different color, or like I give you an example of a green object. You can't actually describe qualia. Qualia themselves are very indescribable. And so, you know, a better way to illustrate this is that, like, there's no way for you to explain the concept of color to a blind person such that they actually experience the color, the experience of the color, the actual qualia, the subjective qualia of color. So, like, you know, a good example would be like if you told a blind person that red is hot and blue is cold, you know, that's just a metaphor. It doesn't actually convey what the experience of color actually is. It's an inadequate metaphor. We use metaphors to kind of bridge the gap in terms of trying to understand things which are difficult to understand, but qualia are very different from that. You can kind of get a sense of what they are through these metaphors, but the actual pure experience of the qualia is intransmissible. So again, the only way a blind person could understand the concept of color is if they could suddenly see, and then they would actually have the experience. It would change them. It wouldn't just be this metaphor. It would actually be an experience. So this suggests the possibility that just as a blind person can't understand color, there are qualia which the ordinary neurotypical unimpaired human mind can't comprehend. An example of this would be, try to imagine a brand new color. You may have heard of this thought experiment. Like right now, try to think about a new color that you've never seen before. And when you try to do this, nothing happens. Your brain can't generate something it hasn't comprehended because it hasn't seen that color before, so it doesn't know what it's referring to. So in a sense, it's impossible for your brain to spontaneously generate a new color. So again, the point I'm trying to make, and I'm sorry that was so brief, is that there are certain experiences which the human mind can't comprehend simply because we lack the sense organs to truly comprehend them. And again, I mean truly comprehend them, not just by way of a metaphorical extension. This is why it is immensely surprising that DMT enables a person to experience qualia which their brains aren't equipped to handle. So in other words, if you're curious about what a different color looks like, just go to this DMT dimension and you'll see brand new colors which your ordinary mind can't perceive. This is a very commonly reported experience. You can see qualia and colors and other sort of experiences which the ordinary human mind flat out can't comprehend. This, in my mind, is evidence of the fact that this experience isn't being generated by the mind, because the mind can't generate something which it hasn't previously experienced in some form. You know, for example, you can imagine like a purple elephant or something, and obviously you've never seen a purple elephant before, but you've seen an elephant and you've seen the color purple. And so your mind can kind of make things based on things that it's experienced before, but brand new experiences are, inaccessible. And yet this DMT dimension, it contains qualia and experiences which the human mind isn't supposed to be able to comprehend. And so again, that's why it seems like this experience isn't being generated by your brain. It's not your brain doing anything. It's you leaving your body and then experiencing this DMT world in kind of an unconstrained manner. And again, it's not just colors, brand new colors that you see. There are brand new smells, sounds, feelings, emotions that you didn't even know were possible. Terence McKenna reported that specifically, that there's an emotion in there that's just not what the human mind can even generate. Now, to be perfectly fair, psychedelics can kind of do something similar to this, because again, there is a whole range of qualia and experiences around you which are ordinarily filtered out. But again, seeing something like a different color, like a brand new color, is not something psychedelics ordinarily allow. It's like I said before, you can be very inventive with a psychedelic drug, but you can't create something that you've just flat out never comprehended. You can't create a brand new qualia. And yet DMT, past this threshold membrane that I've been discussing, does allow you to experience things which, again, the human mind isn't equipped to comprehend. And so I think that this lends evidence. It's not proof. There's a difference between the word proof and the word evidence. Evidence is merely the suggestion of the possibility that the hypothesis is true. Proof is kind of like, it's definitely true. The hypothesis is unquestionably true. And so what I've been discussing so far has been evidence, not necessarily proof. Now, that alone may convince you of the reality of the DMT dimension, but of course, I think most people want more evidence than that. And this brings us to a very interesting thought experiment. What would happen if a blind person were to take DMT? So again, a blind person has never experienced the qualia of color, and they can't, it's been very commonly reported that when blind people take psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin mushrooms, they can't just start seeing colors. You would think that they would be able to have kind of visual hallucinations, but it just doesn't happen. Since their eyes have never perceived color and are kind of dysfunctional in terms of perceiving color, their minds can't just generate color like that. You have to have experienced it in order to generate it. And so blind people they do trip when they have psychedelic experiences, but they don't trip in a visual manner. And so, again, color is just frankly incomprehensible to a blind person. That is, until you take DMT and break through on DMT. Once a blind person breaks through on DMT, it actually has been reported that they can see color. So think about how crazy that is. A blind person who has never experienced color and can never experience color, they break through on this DMT. They go through the chrysanthemum. I guess they wouldn't see the chrysanthemum until they're on the other side. But once they get to the other side, they begin to see. Like, how crazy is that? That has been reported. And of course, the trip that I'm referring to, the subject, he came back from his trip crying and he was just crying because he was like, it was so beautiful. And he asked his friend who was with him in the room, was that what it was like to see? Like, did I just see something? And of course his friend said, I don't know, because how would you know? So this should be enough to boggle the mind. Unfortunately, these accounts which I'm discussing are just kind of scattered on the internet and nobody can verify them. So you may think like, okay, well, they're probably lying, they're probably making it up, it probably didn't happen. But this is where we come to an interesting idea, because it gives us a way to test whether this DMT hypothesis is true. And it involves giving willing participants who hopefully been psychologically screened and who are blind, varying doses of DMT. And then they can measure and report at what point this DMT experience does cause a qualitative shift. And that qualitative shift may be indicative of the fact that they experienced color. Because again, what I'm proposing is you actually do leave your body. And if you actually do leave your body, it would make sense that you actually can perceive color because you're not limited to the mind in which you were born or which you have. Now, of course, there is still the subjective problem because we don't know for sure whether that blind person experienced color or if they experienced something so intense that they just didn't know the difference. If they've never seen color before, it's hard for them to know whether they've seen before. And this is where a modification of the test can be utilized and can give us more clear results. So there are people, and of course you would have to find them specifically, who at one point could see and could experience color, but have since lost their ability to see, and because they haven't seen color in so long, they've basically forgotten what it's like to see color. If these people are given enough DMT and they are able to break through on the DMT dimension, and if they report seeing color, so these are people who have seen it before, and so when they see it again, we'll be able to recognize it. So if such people are able to report seeing color on DMT, again, I think this would lend evidence to the theory that DMT does take you to a different place. And of course, there are reports of this occurring. It's just that, in order to know for sure, the experiments would be, much stronger evidence than merely just kind of finding scattered, reports on the internet. So while this isn't exactly a proof, it does give us an experiment which can be used to kind of lend evidence or even subtract evidence, because this hypothesis could be wrong. That's very much possible. So a way is opened up to kind of using science to conduct these experiments and actually prove what I'm saying is right or disprove it. And I think that the attempt should be made because again, the implications are shattering. So okay, but let's these experiments that I'm proposing are clearly something that haven't been conducted so far. So is there a reason to think that this DMT dimension does take you to a different universe just using the kind of trip reports that we do have? Yes, because there are also qualia which aren't things that certain people can't experience, but but instead that nobody can experience and that nobody can make sense of. And yet DMT seems to present to you very clearly such qualia. And there are numerous examples, but the one which I find the most interesting and the most mind-blowing is that of dimensionality. So we live in a world which is seemingly constructed by three spatial dimensions. You can count time as like the fourth dimension, but for now we'll just consider time a separate dimension. Now the thing is, the world in which we live might actually have higher dimensions, more than three spatial dimensions, but the human mind only evolved to perceive three of them. So that's why we can only experience the world in three dimensions. But of course, objects can exist in higher dimensions, and there are hypothetical objects which we can extend to these higher dimensions even though we can't perceive them. We can't literally see them, but we can kind of think about them, again, using this sort of metaphorical extension. I'll quote Neil deGrasse Tyson. You can think of a square as having two dimensions, as a two-dimensional object. And then you increase the dimension by one, and then you have a cube. Okay, and then increase it again, and then you have a tesseract. Except a tesseract isn't actually something we can perceive. We can make this drawing of a tesseract, but it isn't actually what the tesseract looks like, because again, our minds don't understand the qualia of four dimensions. Four-dimensionality is one of these qualia, which are just frankly incomprehensible for the mind to experience. This is why it's so frankly disturbing that a very, very commonly reported experience on DMT is the ability to perceive the world, this DMT dimension, in a greater number of dimensions than our typical three. It's not clear how many more dimensions. All we know is that it's seemingly more than three, which is why people kind of discuss these impossible angles and this geometry, which is just so perplexing that you can't even describe it because it's in higher dimensions. There are more dimensions here than the typical three we experience. Again, the human mind isn't built to comprehend that. So how is it even possible that this is a very extremely commonly reported experience, that people again are seeing this world, this DMT world, as though it were composed of higher dimensional matter? And here's another way to kind of test this idea. Somebody who is a mathematician or something, who's very familiar and has a coherent notion of what higher dimensions are supposed to be like, we can send them to this DMT dimension, hopefully willingly, and they can report back what they saw. And again, if they report seeing this higher dimensional matter as I've described it, that will strengthen the hypothesis. Again, it's not proof, but it does highly suggest that this DMT dimension really is another place. But just think about that for a second. You break through on DMT, and suddenly things which are utterly utterly incomprehensible. You can't, like, try to imagine what a fourth dimensional object looks like. It's just, nothing happens. Your brain can't do that. And yet you take this DMT and you go to this DMT world, and then suddenly you're there and you can experience these things. It's utterly mind-blowing. And again, it's why I'm so interested in this and why I'm kind of pushing this theory so hard. Because again, if it's true, the implications are completely game changing. And this is actually why I suspect that the DMT dimension is so hard to describe, because frankly we don't have words to describe objects in 4 dimensions, or just plain space in 4 dimensions. Our language evolved in this world, which is a 3-dimensional world, and so our language is suited for this. But you go to this higher dimensional place and then suddenly language just falls apart, because you can't form any notion of what's going on, because you just don't have the words to explain it. And that's why I think that this experience is so hard to depict with words. And of course, if people are actually experiencing higher dimensions, this would lend evidence to the theory that this DMT experience is real, that you really are going to a different place. Another indescribable phenomenon is that of nonlinear time. And in fact, in the original book, I wrote something like 8 paragraphs describing like Einstein's notion of time and how time works in this universe and how you can break time using things like black holes. But I guess I'll just simplify all that and basically say that nonlinear time is theoretically possible. It's just that we don't know how to perceive that. Our minds don't comprehend something like that. And yet, this DMT dimension seems to be a place where nonlinear time is a literal reality, which again, I'll just leave you with that, because that's a crazy thing. And that's also probably explains why there's this huge time dilation effect. When you go to this DMT dimension, you perceive it to happen to have 3 months. 3 months go by, or something, several weeks, several months go by, and then you come back and you find out it's only been 3 minutes. Again, I think this is just your brain trying to comprehend the experience of time in a place in which time doesn't operate by the same rules as our time, if that makes sense. Again, it's very mysterious, and it's probably better left for later videos. So again, if you're an extremely rigorous and logical thinker and are sort of built into the kind of materialistic worldview, which is kind of what the West is trying to make us, the way the West wants us to think these days, you probably realize that none of the experiments which I proposed, without a doubt, prove that this DMT experience is superconscious. And, it may seem like right away that it's impossible to prove that the experience is superconscious, because each experience is subjective. So you just have to kind of rely on one person explaining it to you. And, anything could have happened to their minds. It's just that, we have to just take their word for what's going on. And that isn't definitive proof. Proof by scientific means, needs to have a much higher standard. However, believe it or not, there is a way to prove that this DMT dimension is real without a shadow of a doubt, essentially irrefutably true. I mean, you could refute it if you were stubborn, but at that point, I would suspect ideology is involved rather than, the pursuit of truth. But there is a scientific way to prove that this DMT dimension is real, and here's how the logic behind this experiment works. So if this DMT dimension is real, as I'm suggesting, it means that different people who take DMT and who break through on DMT to this DMT dimension should be able to see each other in this DMT world, because presumably we're all going to the same place when we smoke DMT. Now, believe it or not, there are accounts of 2 or more people smoking DMT at the same time and encountering each other during their experience. In fact, Psyched Substance, the person who kind of originally led me down this rabbit hole, has an experience like this on his channel. You can go check that out, where he and his girlfriend both took DMT and they encountered each other in various scenarios. And after the trip was over, they both recounted the fact that they saw each other in these different scenarios, and they recounted specific details, and so they were both mind blown at the fact that they both saw the same things during their experience. Now, actually, interestingly enough, this experience by Psyched Substance is very different from all the DMT experiences that I've discussed so far. So while it does lend evidence to the superconscious theory, it does imply other things which I will need to discuss later, which we'll tackle separately in a later video. But the point is, now we have an experimental method to prove the reality of the DMT dimension. You don't have to take Adam's word for it. Adam is Psyched Substance. You don't have to take his word for it, or any of the other people who have tried this experiment of smoking DMT at the same time as somebody else. You don't have to believe them, because we now have a specific way to actually prove that the DMT dimension is real. And here's how it works. You take 2 people who are going to take DMT at the same time. They either know each other or they don't know each other. It doesn't really matter, I guess. And you tell one of them separately a specific message, something like, I don't know, pancakes or something. Preferably something more specific, just so that it's less difficult to guess. So one person is told the message and the other person isn't. and they both take DMT and go to this DMT dimension. Now, if the one person can convey the message to the other person, and that other person is able to come back down and repeat the message, to the message that we're going with is pancakes. So if that person who wasn't told the message can give you the message and he says pancakes, it will be unquestionable proof that this DMT dimension is real. Otherwise, how did they transmit that message to each other? Especially given, the description that they'll be giving. By that, I mean the fact that they've subjectively experienced this DMT dimension. That will be unquestionable, irrefutable proof that this DMT dimension is real. Obviously, this experiment hasn't occurred yet, but again, it gives us a method to test this. Even though I'm speculating here, there is a way to prove whether I'm right or wrong. Like I said before, this isn't like me trying to claim that the afterlife is real and then just not giving you any reason to think about it or to think that it's true. This is completely different. There is an actual way to test this, and if we test it rigorously enough, it will turn out to be either true or false. Now, there are some caveats involved with this experiment. Firstly, it makes the assumption that these two people will in fact encounter each other in this DMT dimension, which isn't totally clear if that's going to happen, and it's not a guarantee because this DMT dimension can be so huge that two people will just never encounter each other or will never even be able to recognize each other. It also makes the assumption that these two people will be able to communicate because, again, communication in this DMT dimension seems to be completely different, and so the word pancakes or whatever it is may be literally untransmissible. Lastly, it also makes the assumption that the person will remember the message and remember to give it because they might just end up in this DMT dimension and get sidetracked because, again, it feels like you're there for several weeks. So you might end up doing something else for several weeks. And then by the time it's over, you've completely forgotten about the mission, so to speak. But again, I do think that we should at least try this experiment because if it succeeds, it will, again, shatter reality as we know it. And of course, the experiment needs to be repeated enough times so that we know it's not just a fluke. With different people and different sort of contexts, maybe we send 5 different people instead and things like that. Different variations of this experiment will provide more and more evidence that this DMT dimension is real or not. So the whole point of this discussion, and it's very long by now, was to convince you of the possibility that this DMT dimension actually does exist. That when you smoke DMT and you break through on DMT, you literally do go to a different universe. And even if you aren't convinced, there are ways to kind of test my hypothesis. And so I don't expect everybody to be convinced by this. In fact, I don't really expect anybody to be convinced by it, but there are ways to kind of test this hypothesis. And then if it turns out to be true, this fact of DMT taking you to a different dimension will be a fact. It will be a fact the same way that electromagnetism is a fact, or that atoms are a fact, or that DNA is a fact. It will be something that's just known to science. Science will have to accept that this is true. It's as crazy as it sounds, as paradigm shattering as it sounds, that will be the inevitable conclusion if these experiments are carried out. And again, it doesn't seem like something like that is scientific, but again, these experiments would prove it. And again, there's nothing like this in existence. There's nothing like this in the realms of human knowledge. The fact that there are realities which exist beyond our comprehension, and yet somehow we can comprehend them using a drug, and this world seemingly exists above ours, and that is more complicated than ours and construed of more higher dimensions than our own world. It's completely crazy, and yet it's seemingly possible. So again, if you're not convinced, I completely understand. I do hope that I did make a fair case for the reality of the DMT dimension. If you're not convinced, I'd love to know why. There are flaws in my reasoning for sure, and there are probably gaps that I haven't even noticed. So if you do notice any flaws in my logic, please let me know and we'll discuss, I guess. But from going on forward, I'm going to be assuming that the DMT dimension is actually real. And the reason I'm doing this is to speculate about how this could even be possible if it is real. So by just kind of taking the position that DMT does take you to a different dimension, I'll be kind of setting myself up to kind of explain how it's possible. And like I said before, it's actually kind of logically consistent and kind of does make sense. Like, I feel like in the end, a lot of people will realize that this kind of does make sense. It kind of does make sense that as crazy as it sounds, it kind of does make sense that DMT can take you to a different place. And again, I hope to make that case going forward. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I anticipate mixed feelings about it, but that's okay. I am just speculating here. I could be completely wrong. In fact, some days I think I am completely wrong. Apologies for my dog barking really loud. But anyways, thank you all for watching this video. I hope that you're enjoying this series so far, and that even if you're not convinced, you're at least intrigued. So yeah, have a great day, and I'll see you on the next video. Peace.